As the calendar turns to 2019, Canadians are looking down the road to see what's coming over the horizon. For some Canadians, the view is a little foreboding. While the pundits and pollsters have a different view as to what 2019 will bring, the one common thread through their work is that Canadians are probably the most cynical they've ever been. Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. While 2018 gave us tariffs, Trans Mountain, and the late-night Twitter tirades of Trump, 2019 is shaping up to be an even nastier version of last year. As we start to navigate through 2019 here on the Unpublished Cafe, we're looking ahead of the benchmarks facing this country. And in an election year at that, it's safe to say the federal election appears to be the defining moment of 2019 at this point. But there's still plenty of racetrack left before the polls on October 21st. Today on the Unpublished Cafe, we'll chat with three pollsters about what they hear from Canadians about their lives, their beliefs, their wishes, and their politics. Joining us later in the show, Darrel Bricker, founder and CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs. As well, Nick Nanos of Nanos Research will bring us his perspective on how Canadians feel heading into 2019. And to start us off, I'm pleased to be joined by David Coletto of Abacus Data in Ottawa. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Ed. How are you?
Good, and you?
Well, thank you.
Abacus took a look at Canadians as 2018 came to a close. How are they feeling?
They're feeling, I think, there's mixed views out there. I think depending on where you live and you know what place in your life you're going to have different views. For example, if you live in Alberta, you will have very different views of, you know, how you think the economy is doing, your own personal opportunities than if you live in Quebec or Ontario. I think for the most part, people are still feeling more positive. They think there's more people who think Canada's headed in the right direction than the wrong direction. But when we ask some specific questions around what's going on around the world, how you're feeling about things in the United States, there we start to see, you know, significant majorities of people feeling pretty pessimistic about what's going on. And so on the one hand, we can feel perhaps some comfort that things in Canada perhaps are going a little bit better than in other parts of the world, but we're also worried about what impact those forces, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's Brexit, whether it's, you know, the rise of populism and economic uncertainty, what all that means for us as we try to navigate what obviously is a very globalized world, but still we're not an island, and so we're impacted by what goes on around the world.
So, what did your respondents agree on? The majorities agree on?
Well, what we asked at the end of the year what they would like to happen in 2019 and then what they think will happen. And we gave them a number of options. And what's clear is that, you know, there's a real desire. I think there's growing concern about climate change, right? And so there's a real desire for most Canadians, 90% or so, who would like to see, you know, a technological breakthrough or some kind of breakthrough that really speeds up our ability to deal with climate change. There's also this, regardless of what political orientation you are in Canada, real dislike for the President of the United States, Donald Trump. 80% of Canadians say they would like him to leave office at some point in 2019. But when you ask, do you think it's likely to happen? Just about half as many think it is. Only 41% think he will actually leave office. So there's a real angst, I think, against Donald Trump that really does unite, whether you're a liberal, a conservative, a Democrat, in that hope. Some other things that I think are really interesting, you know, at least in the political realm, was debating pipeline and energy. And I think 2019, we are going to see that play a figurative role as we debate carbon pricing and pipelines as well. Majority of Canadians, 6 out of 10, say they'd like construction to begin on Trans Mountain pipeline. And this is something that, you know, is sometimes surprising to people because the debate around that pipeline, for example, appears to be so divisive and so controversial, and it is in many parts of the country. If you live in British Columbia, if you're, you know, an Indigenous group around the route of that pipeline, yes, you know, there's strong opposition to it. But in most parts of the country, in fact, all parts of the country, even in Quebec, there's a general sense that, you know, building that pipeline is something that we should do. But again, there's perhaps some pessimism about whether it will actually happen. You know, only a small, actually, there's a little more optimism. 56% think it actually will happen. So those are some of the big issues I think we're watching. If you're a sports fan, and a Leafs fan in particular, I think there's always more hope than there is expectation that the Leafs might win the Stanley Cup this year. There's I think a broad hope that they do, but very little expectation that they will. Only 28% of Canadians think the Leafs will win the Cup. And then the question of Brexit, right? End of March is the scheduled point at which the UK will leave the European Union. Canadians are looking at that as something that they don't really want to happen. Only 30% of Canadians hope that Britain ends up leaving the EU, but a majority believe it will happen. And so these are some of the big events, along with our federal election, that I think Canadians are really going to be paying attention to as we live through what will be for some, an exciting, for others, a very anxious 2019.
Now, when you looked at, I looked at your report on the end of the year for Canadians, and you found that there's been this, I guess, growing, increasing need and desire for more focus on energy and climate issues. People want progress in that fight against climate change, and they also want Canada to participate sensibly in energy markets that exist today. Can Canadians really have both?
I think that we can, and that's a consistent viewpoint we find, right? That on the one hand, Canadians recognize that eventually and probably sooner rather than later, we will have to transition away from fossil fuels. That it's a trend that we have to do if we're going to, save our planet and deal with climate change. But on the other hand, we also, I think, recognize we have this resource. There's still a demand for it, and so how do we produce it? How do we extract it? How do we move it in a way that moves the dial on climate change either way? And so while it might seem contradictory, that's where most people are. They're in the middle. They're not, they're not extreme on one end or the other. Most Canadians don't say shut down the oil sands, and most say, let's ignore, efforts to deal with climate change. And so as we think about the next election, it appears today at least that both the two main parties that are going to be competing for power, the Conservatives and the Liberals, are going to want to make that election about one tool, the carbon tax, one tool to deal with climate change. And one consequence of that is it kind of has isolated every other opportunity or every other option that we have to deal with climate change. And we focus all our energy on whether there should be a carbon tax or not. I think my view is that increasingly Canadians are being divided not just on whether you think climate change is happening or not. Most Canadians do. There's a small minority who aren't convinced that climate change is real or that we can do anything to stop it. For the vast majority who do believe it's happening, though, I think there is a serious discussion and debate about what's the best way to deal with it. And as you tie in concerns around affordability, which is this elephant in the room, I think, right? Rising interest rates, rising costs of food, rising costs of housing, all of these things are putting pressure on people's pocketbooks. And as a result, it's creating conflict even within, I think, an individual's thinking about these issues. That, yes, I want to deal with climate change, but can I really afford to do it? And where we end up falling on that spectrum might ultimately determine which party wins in 2019, whether it's the Conservatives and Andrew Scheer or Justin Trudeau and the Liberals, or some other party that figures out how to navigate that seeming contradiction in terms of people's thinking.
David Coletto of Abacus Data joining us in the Unpublished Cafe as we take a look ahead to 2019 and how Canadians are feeling about their futures as well as their politics. And well, let's look at the federal election. It appears to be likely the biggest issue or the biggest event for Canada in 2019. And carbon pricing, as you had mentioned, do you expect that to be the defining issue of this election?
I think it's looking like the two main parties want it to be. I think they are gearing up for a fight around that. I think there will be other issues. In fact, when you ask Canadians, what's the most important issue facing the country, actually climate change is not the highest on that list. It's like 5 or 6. Healthcare, affordability, these are the issues that Canadians are much more likely to say are big issues for them. But I think what's happened is the debate around the carbon tax or price and what we do about climate change has become a proxy in a way for the type of approach or the type of government that you want. And it's dividing us by region. Again, you have Western Canada, Alberta, Saskatchewan, really on one side of that, and Quebec firmly, and BC to some extent firmly on the other. And so it really will come down to Ontario, I think, as often the case, given that we have so many seats, to decide, really where we're going. So I think climate change is going to play figuratively, probably more so than it really ever has. And I think that's because we've had more warning signs that things are moving faster than we thought. Canadians are increasingly concerned about it. And, my generation, those under the age of 35, can play a big role in the outcome of the election. And they're the most concerned about it because they're the ones you're going to have to deal with, in many ways, the consequences of climate change. So I think personally it's an important issue, but it's one in which can be overshadowed by more personal or micro issues like, again, affordability. The healthcare system is going to be there when I need it. I feel like I'm paying too much taxes. Those things can sometimes trump it, but I have the sense that it's not only do Canadians want to debate it, but I think the political leaders are really positioning things for that to be central to the debate.
And in terms of the debate, we're going to be looking at leaders for the parties, and right now, obviously, Justin Trudeau, he's the incumbent. Andrew Scheer is a lesser known, although obviously he's got the party behind him, and Jagmeet Singh is having a lot of difficulty right now. What does he need to do to turn it around?
Well, I think the first thing he has to win is by-election, which now has been called, and so we will, for once and for all, know whether that issue will be settled. If he wins the by-election, which in conversations he should win that by-election, and then that will give him a platform in which to try to raise his profile and start to be part of the conversation again. One of the interesting things, I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday about this, and the narrative in the media and among, I think, pundits here in Ottawa is that Jagmeet Singh has performed poorly and they're struggling. On the one hand, when you ask people who would make the best prime minister, Jagmeet Singh is tied with Elizabeth May, right, in around 10 or 11%. That's not good for the leader of the third party. On the flip side, when you ask a more generic question, who are you going to vote for, the NDP is still polling around 16, 17, 18% in most polls. And so they haven't completely collapsed, which suggests there is still interest among a large number of Canadians to support the New Democrats and are willing to hear them. And so in some instances, the bar has been set so low for Jagmeet Singh that if he does win the by-election and uses that as a way to enter Parliament and to raise profile, I wouldn't count him out. And I believe he's probably the only political leader in Canada who could go viral in the sense that he is unique, he's different, he brings an interesting perspective and an interesting story to politics that we haven't seen before. And so I'm still watching because I'm not counting him out. And that would create some challenges for the Liberals because they really do need to consolidate, progressive, center-left kind of voters in Canada if they're going to be able to compete against what seems to be a much more competitive Conservative Party today than even a few years ago.
What issue do you see that's on the back burner right now that could become real hot for the upcoming campaign?
I think, I've been monitoring housing affordability, right? It's not that it's on the back burner or people aren't worried about it. In fact, when we ask Canadians, what are the issues or what do you want government to prioritize, housing affordability is always near the top of the list. And yet it seems that none of the political leaders are talking about it. And so that suggests to me there's an opportunity. I don't know what the solution is, and I don't know how government, particularly the federal government, solves the concerns that people have. But in not just big cities across this country, but in many smaller and mid-sized communities, the question of how do I afford not just buy a home and get into the market, but keep the home I have with rising interest rates is something that I think is ripe for a debate. And I've noted that, particularly among younger Canadians who are really looking to buy that home, it's harder than it's ever been, that the pot is starting to boil. And if an enterprising political party or leader sees that opportunity, that could become an issue that starts to galvanize people to support a particular party or not. So that's one I'm watching in particular, is this question of, the broader affordability, cost of living question, but that really tied to that dream of owning a home, which most Canadians still say is something, if they don't own a home, they want to achieve at some point in their life.
David, I want to thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. I think that.
And David Coletto is the founder and CEO of Abacus Data in Ottawa. Now, he pointed out there were a number of things that Canadians are hopeful or optimistic about heading into 2019. When Darrel Bricker of Ipsos Public Affairs took a look, there was a common thread of pessimism when it came to day-to-day life. And joining us to elaborate more on 2019 for Canadians, I am pleased to be joined by Darrel Bricker. And Darrel, you found Canadians were in a gloomy mood when it came to their finances. How gloomy are they?
Well, they're still reasonably optimistic, but the problem isn't so much how they feel about how things are going just this year or even next year. It's really about how they're feeling about the evolution of their life in general. And when they think about their life in general, they're not just thinking about themselves, they're thinking about their station versus their parents and what they expect for their kids. And what we see over time is this general sense of overall decline, that things are not getting better. So even in the short term, if they might be feeling good, although they're feeling less good this year than they were last year, it's that general sense of overall decline that is a real problem for the government.
But are they really in decline, or they just feel they are?
They feel they are, but in this game, Ed, it's not so much about what the facts are. It's really about how you feel. So you can go out and you can say to them, hey, unemployment, is way down. You should be feeling great. And their answer is, but I don't feel great. I don't feel especially, secure. I don't feel like I'm making any progress. I don't feel that the job that I have, even though in the unemployment statistics, it says that I'm employed, I don't think I'm employed at the level that I expected that I was going to be employed at. So there's this underlying current of decline that at any moment could spring up and take over beyond what the actual economic statistics are, or even how they're feeling necessarily about their short-term prospects.
I would imagine then that the party that can tap into that feeling through the election campaign in 2019 has a pretty good chance of coming out on top.
Exactly. And if you take a look back to 2015 and 2011, back in 2011, Stephen Harper was able to plug into that. And in 2015, Justin Trudeau was. So the question is now, with Justin Trudeau 3 years in, and by the time we have the election, 4 years into his mandate, are people feeling any better today than they were 3 years ago? That's the question that's really going to be on the table. And it's not going to be about, whether or not we have, hopeful change or any of that kind of stuff. It's what people are experiencing on their kitchen tables. Is their life any more affordable? Do they feel that they're making any type of progress? That'll be the real question that will be confronted this time. And what we saw in 2015 was that the Liberals were able to cut through on that and make a difference.
Now, you've said the Liberals are in a good position heading into 2019. They're leading where they need to be. Where are they? Where do they need to lead, and where are they vulnerable?
Well, they're vulnerable in a few places. Obviously, in Western Canada, with the exception of British Columbia, they've got a lot of work to do. I mean, Alberta's going to be very difficult for them this time. British Columbia, they've got more than a fighting chance. If they've got a place that could potentially pick up some seats, it might be in British Columbia because the NDP isn't doing that well. And then where they're really vulnerable is, I would say, I know everybody talks about Quebec. Yes, that's a problem. But the real big vulnerability where they could potentially lose a significant number of seats is the province of Ontario. And in 2011, the group that decided the outcome of the election was the 905. So that's that donut of seats around the city of Toronto. There's probably 35 to 40 of them, depending on how you measure it. In 2015, they also decided the election. 2011, they went almost universally to Stephen Harper. 2015, they went universally to Justin Trudeau. And then in the most recent provincial election here in Ontario, they went almost universally to Doug Ford. So this is the big swing group, and because it's such a significant number of seats in a place that goes back and forth, that's where the election gets decided. So the question is, who's going to win that area? And at the current moment, their big issue agenda is really around the issue of affordability and taxes. Am I making progress on those 2 points? And they're feeling not so good about it.
How do you feel Ford Nation will sort of fit into the next election?
Well, the thing about Doug Ford is, both him and his brother, Rob, were, in terms of, media analysis and punditry, unbelievably underestimated all the time. Unbelievably underestimated. And so I wouldn't count them out as having an effect. They have a way of motivating voters that is similar to the way that Justin Trudeau does. There's kind of a celebrity factor that goes into this, where people feel that they both kind of approve of who they, the values that these politicians present, and they kind of, see themselves as being part of that movement. Not necessarily so much as Ford Nation, but the ideas that are around that, and Doug Ford embodying them. So I think it's going to be a very interesting showdown. I mean, obviously the provincial government's going to have some policy difficulties going forward. They've got a lot of big issues to deal with in Ontario. Plus, we're going to have a pretty big fight on the issue of the carbon tax over the next while, which is pretty divided. Who comes out on top, I think, is really still up in the air.
Darrel Bricker of Ipsos Public Affairs joining us in the Unpublished Cafe as we look back at the end of 2018 and how Canadians felt, and looking ahead to 2019. And we'll look at the party leaders. Obviously, Justin Trudeau, very familiar around the world, and that comes with being the incumbent. And we have two fairly new leaders in Andrew Scheer and Jagmeet Singh. Being the incumbent usually comes with a benefit, but it can be a double-edged sword because you carry all the, the baggage of the last 4 years.
Yeah, I'm going to say something kind of controversial at this point. I don't think it really even matters what, the awareness level of Jagmeet Singh or Andrew Scheer is going to be. This next election is going to be a referendum on Justin Trudeau. So he is universally well known in the country. The question is, do you think that he's directed the country in the direction that almost all about Justin Trudeau and really not that much about the other leaders? So as much as the Liberals will want to attack Andrew Scheer, nobody knows who Andrew Scheer is. Or they will want to attack Jagmeet Singh. Nobody really knows who that is either. It will really all be about everything that Justin Trudeau does, whether he's attacking or whether he's advocating, really being a reflection about what he is going to offer to Canadians for the next 4 years. So it will be a referendum on his leadership and his government.
So you don't see this as some issues will be, coming to the forefront. Some people feel carbon pricing will be the top issue. Some will feel the negative feeling toward the economy will be the top issue. You feel this will all be a referendum on Justin Trudeau?
Yeah, so on carbon pricing, will they really care what the, it's kind of funny when I see these tweets coming out from, Liberals about Andrew Scheer doesn't have a plan on carbon. And it's like, nobody knows who Andrew Scheer is and nobody knows what a plan on carbon looks like anyway. The question is whether or not they actually believe that what Justin Trudeau is planning on doing is the right thing, and how that plays against those big issues that they're concerned about. So, for example, affordability and taxes, not just the environment. So what he says about it is what's going to be under scrutiny, not so much what Andrew Scheer says about it or what Jagmeet Singh says about it. It'll be really the focus of the attention for voters will be on what Justin Trudeau is saying and planning. You don't see any alternate issue that could change the course of the campaign from that? You know what? One of the things that I learned from polling, and I do this all over the world, right? I mean, Ipsos, we do more political polling in more countries than anybody. And I can tell you, every time I say I think I know what's going on, I end up being wrong. So I think campaigns really are important, and they become more important. They become more important over time, and that's because partisanship has become such an elusive thing. So the idea that somebody is a liberal for life or a conservative for life or a new Democrat for life is, there's core support obviously for those various parties, but people can move and people can change. So I think the electorate remanufactures itself every time we go into an election campaign. There are certain groups that they're going to go in certain ways, but Justin Trudeau, went from third place to first place, and not by a little, by a lot. Mm-hmm. In the course of the last election campaign. That was a huge amount of movement. You generally don't see that. Sometimes you'll see some movement back and forth and they kind of settle back down to where they were at the start, but that didn't really happen this time. So there's a level of volatility that suggests, yes, there could be some issues that emerge during the course of the campaign that really reveal people's particular leadership character that could end up being very important. And what they are is difficult to predict right now.
Darrel, I want to thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure, Ed. Thanks for having me on.
Darrel Bricker is the founder and CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs. Money issues, job security, rising personal debt, all weighing on the down feeling of Canadians. As we've heard, it's leading to a lot of anxiety. Nanos research took the pulse of Canadians and found that that most are worried things will get worse for them and the overall economy. To talk more about that and what to watch in 2019, I'm pleased to be joined by Nick Nanos, founder and CEO of Nanos Research. Now, Nick, it's not the federal election that has Canadians worried, but the possibility of a recession. How much of that is built into reality when we see such strong job numbers?
Well, the thing is, I think it would be fair to say that there's a fundamental disconnect between some of the macroeconomic numbers that people see, like employment or unemployment, and how they actually feel. In a survey that we did with CTV News that you referred to earlier, and we asked whether people are worried or not worried about a possible recession in 2019, about 6 out of every 10 Canadians were either worried or somewhat worried on this, and only a minority, didn't think that it was going to be an issue. And this speaks to the psychology. People hear about, the closure of the General Motors plant in Oshawa. They know that the energy sector is in crisis right now, and there's talk of a government bailout on that front. And those signals send the message that perhaps things aren't great in terms of the economy, and as a result, it's creating psychological jitters out there.
So from your talking to Canadians, you found that most of them are sort of pessimistic, to say the least?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they're pessimistic. And, maybe one way to think of this, even though some of the macroeconomic numbers like unemployment look relatively good, it's joyless prosperity. They look at those numbers, and hypothetically, they should feel good because the unemployment rate is down, but they don't feel good. And, we shouldn't underestimate the impact that this can actually have on the economy, what I'll say this negative psychology, because think of it this way. If someone can afford to buy, and I'll just make up something, a fridge or a pickup truck or whatever it is, and they can afford it, they need it, they plan for it, but then they think that the economy is going to weaken, that perhaps they don't have as much job security, they delay these purchases. And the delaying of purchases in terms of consumer consumption can have an immediate effect on the economy.
How much do you see that possibility of a recession and the negative feeling playing into the next federal election?
I think it's going to be the key ballot question. And usually the economy, jobs and the economy and fiscal issues are always key drivers. And I always kind of divide the world when it comes to politics and issues into 2 buckets. Things that people take an interest in and things that drive behavior. So, when the government wants to talk about Indigenous issues and reconciliation, people have an interest in that. When they want to talk about the environment, people are interested in that. When they talk about the legalization of marijuana, people have an interest in that. But those things don't necessarily drive behavior because those things don't stack up to, do I have a job? Can my son or daughter get a job when they graduate from college or university? So economic issues are usually one of the key drivers, especially if they think that there's uncertainty and they look at the party leaders in terms of whether they are risky choices or not risky choices. So if we head into any kind of minor recession or even a major recession, that'll be the main focus of voters, and they're going to want to hear from all the parties on what their plans are, and they're going to judge the Liberals. Did they spend enough time on economic issues to do everything possible in order to minimize the impact of a potential downturn?
When we look at a thing like a possibility of a recession and the feeling of the pessimism about the economy, I think it's safe to say the Conservatives are leading in that department with their party. But when you've got such a rookie leader, will that work against them in the election?
Well, it could work against them, and then maybe, and if you're a Conservative listening, you might clutch your chest when I say this, is perhaps the Conservatives can take a page from Jean Chrétien back in 1992. And, I know, Ed, you'll remember, but in 1992, the polling numbers for Jean Chrétien were not positive. He was viewed as yesterday's man. He was old. He was the Trudeau, the other Trudeau guy, and he was a blast from the past. And what did the Liberals do that time? They did not focus on Jean Chrétien. They actually focused on the team and the plan. They had the now famous Red Book, but they also focused on the team of strong candidates that they had. I think for the Conservatives, they need to do the same thing. It'll take time for people to warm up to Andrew Scheer, assuming that they do warm up to him. However, if the Conservatives can get they don't need a bunch. They need like 10 strong candidates that have the potential experience or the background or the resume to be substantive, strong ministers. And that can help Andrew Scheer. So for Andrew Scheer, he needs to recruit talent across the country that shows that he is a government in waiting, and that on the economic front, that the Conservatives are a viable alternative. The upside for Scheer is our polling traditionally always suggests that in most instances, people think that the Conservatives are better than the Liberals on economic and tax issues. So he can play to that advantage, but he could put not just himself, but a strong team around him to show that he's a government in waiting.
Nick Nanos of Nanos Research joining us on the Unpublished Cafe as we talk about what Canadians are looking forward to in 2019, and in particular politics. And, I think one of the wild cards, I think, for Andrew Scheer in that situation, if the economy becomes the key issue, the one sort of wild card that's sort of sitting in the back there is Maxime Bernier and his new party. How do you see that playing out?
I think Maxime Bernier and his new party is going to be a significant disruptor, especially in the media, for Andrew Scheer. Our polling right now suggests that only about 10% of Canadians would even consider voting for Maxime Bernier's party, and that he's at 1% or 1 or 2% support, depending on what day of the week that it is. That said, that doesn't mean that he can't pick up more support. But I think it's going to be very difficult for him to hit the critical mass where he's going to be a major player. So can he win an election? Why don't we just say today, no. Can he come second? No. Could he come third? Well, he would really need something spectacular to happen for him to come third. But his impact is going to be in the media, because he will be a disruptor for Andrew Scheer, a policy disruptor, and what I'll say, a message disruptor. And the media will, whenever things like that happen, the media will give Maxime Bernier a platform, because it'll make for a more interesting race. So picture Andrew Scheer looking over, I won't say his left shoulder, he's going to look over his right shoulder and see Maxime Bernier there, and probably having to respond to Maxime Bernier, and that will only diminish Andrew Scheer, because the reality is Andrew Scheer's opponent is Justin Trudeau, and that's who Andrew Scheer needs to engage.
Now, how do you see Bernier impacting federal results in Quebec?
There's probably a greater likelihood for him to, if he was smart, I shouldn't say if he was smart, but the best path forward for Maxime Bernier would be to try to build a regional campaign in the Beauce around him, and to take the money that he does raise and to invest that in the Beauce area, which is in Quebec. He has a base in that region. He's been the regional minister there. His family has a political base there, and to try to win a few other ridings. That said, even if he wins a couple more ridings, we shouldn't dismiss him as a political force, because when we look at the polling, at least in the last few weeks, that there's a likelihood that we could have a minority government. So, imagine if we're looking at having a crystal ball for 2019, imagine a minority government where neither the Liberals nor the Conservatives have enough seats to form a majority government with their own party. And then on one side of the equation, look at Elizabeth May maybe picking up a couple more seats for the Green Party, and then Maxime Bernier, hypothetically, or even potentially winning another seat or two. And that would provide for a very interesting dynamic, because, you'd have a progressive Green Party on one side, and then we'd have a very traditional Conservative Party on the other side, both in a minority parliament and exercising influence.
Yeah, you talk about the view of Canadians and their pessimistic feel, so the economy being pretty well the top issue going into the next election. But where do you see carbon pricing?
Well, carbon pricing will be up there, especially for what I'll say the Conservative base and working Canadians. It's interesting when we look globally on a polling basis on carbon pricing. Emmanuel Macron, who is a progressive and also swept to victory, is just getting hammered in the polls, and his government is getting hammered with massive violent protests against, for all intents and purposes, carbon pricing. So, the thing is that right now, Canadians don't like anything that increases taxes, and they're cross-pressured, right? Of course they want to protect the environment, but they're also consumers. So for the Liberals, the challenge for them is, once carbon pricing is implemented, and if there's the view that it has increased prices, and that people are bearing the brunt for that, then there'll be a price to pay for the Liberals. Now, what the Liberals are trying to do is to send out checks to Canadians. In my experience, maybe this is cynical, but in my experience, when governments send out checks to voters, voters take the checks, but they don't mindlessly give their votes to the government of the day. If you remember, leading up to the last 2015 election, the Harper government sent out checks when it changed family benefits. Canadians cashed those checks. Stephen Harper lost the election. So we shouldn't think that that's a vote winner. It helps them manage the issue, but it doesn't necessarily send that problem away.
Nick, I want to thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Nick Nanos is the founder and CEO of Nanos Research. Now it's time for you to weigh in on unpublished.vote. We want to hear from you. What do you feel will be the defining issue of the 2019 Canadian election? Carbon pricing, immigration, health care, climate change, or other? And you can fill in your choice. Log on to unpublished.vote and have your say. I want to thank David Coletto, Darrel Bricker, and Nick Nanos for joining us on the Unpublished Cafe and providing some insight. Thanks for listening. I'm Ed Hand.